What's up, hockey fans? Welcome to the Wraparound, brought to you by the Hockey News. I am your host, Emma Lingan. I am joined today by Michael Augello and Frank Zawrazky of the Hockey News. We've got lots to talk about today, especially for the dog days of summer here. Got lots going on this week in the hockey world, so gonna get into all of it. We've got some front office news. We've got some contract extensions and signings, and some more rumors going on. So gonna get into all of that, of course. But first, before we do, want to remind you that for over 75 years, the Hockey News has been the ultimate hockey fix. Now get 12 issues delivered straight to you, packed with stories, stats, and a bonus gift issue. To kick things off, head over to thn.com and get in on the action. All right, so as I mentioned, some front office news, rather shocking front office news this week, and that is that Steve Yzerman has abruptly stepped down as GM of the Detroit Red Wings. That happened on Wednesday. He is going to become an advisor to Chris Ilitch, the team owner. So still going to be around in the building. Don't exactly know what that new role is going to look like for him, but abruptly stepping down as GM. Of course, he spent 7 seasons with the franchise as a GM, had 0 playoff appearances in his tenure. Of course, the much ballyhooed Yzer plan was supposed to be worth waiting for, and we never quite got to see it come to fruition in Detroit. But Mike, do you think Yzerman's tenure as GM is going to impact his overall legacy with the Red Wings franchise? Because obviously we know that he meant a lot to that franchise prior to taking over as an executive. And beyond that, I mean, as they look ahead, is there anyone who stands out as someone who might be able to take over for him?
Well, whoever it is, I wouldn't feel very comfortable with him basically advising the owner. But, I mean, I think this was his decision. I look at the situation here, and I mean, you have to say the Yzer plan was a failure because they didn't make the playoffs. They didn't really succeed. He added a whole bunch of really good talent, but it might be a Kevyn Adams situation where the next guy comes in and he's the beneficiary of all those players that he added. But I think, the Dylan Larkin situation probably led to this because I think Yzerman was he pigeonholed himself into a situation where he needed to make a hockey deal for Larkin. And more than likely, I don't think that they can make a hockey deal for Larkin. I think it's going to have to be a futures deal. I think, maybe he has to expand his list and give more than 4 teams, but whoever trades for him, it's going to be prospects and picks. It's not going to be a hockey trade because he wants to go to teams that are Stanley Cup contenders, and they don't want to make hockey deals. So I think maybe that was the entree to him saying, I can't do this, and let the other guy, take the step back and rejigger things. But in the end, I think his tenure is going to be looked upon as a failure.
And I mean, looking at any potential options in your mind, Mike, of someone who could replace Yzerman as GM?
Well, I joked and said Pat Verbeek, but that would just basically be going down the same road. I don't know. I mean, a lot of the general manager prospects like Scott White, who was in on the Toronto job and the Vancouver job, and maybe that's a possibility. But it has to be, I would think it would be somebody from the Yzerman tree because he has some influence, but most of those general managers like Julian Brisebois and Matthew Darsh are already general managers. So I don't think they're going to leave their current positions. So it might be somebody young and that Yzerman, tutors him for a while, but it's really late in the game. We're almost to August, and then now you're making a switch like in midstream. It's not ideal.
Yeah, the timing of this is it's hard to ignore, and especially you mentioned Dylan Larkin and that whole situation. You got to wonder what is going to happen now with Dylan Larkin. So, Frank, when you sort of assess what's happening here in Detroit, I mean, how do you see them moving forward? Do you think that they go with sort of an interim GM kind of situation? Do you expect them to hire someone right away? And how do you see this, working out not just for Yzerman, but for the franchise now moving forward?
Well, Emma, I'm going to answer the first part of your question. I expect them to hire someone methodically. May not be right away, but they have to get this right because Yzerman, the player, was an icon in Detroit, will always be treated as an icon in Detroit. Yzerman's legacy as a general manager is a little complicated in my opinion, because he had sometimes poor asset management. Jake Wallman's trade, the Cop deal, just to name two off the top of my head. But keep in mind, he also drafted Lucas Raymond and Moritz Seider. So that may balance each other out. So I don't think Yzerman is a total failure. I just don't think he is what people expected out of him as a general manager. He was below expectations and an average general manager. In terms of what happens going forward, who knows? Maybe Dylan Larkin decides to stay after this general manager trade. Maybe they move some things around behind the scenes that we're not privy to, talk with his agent, and maybe he decides, I'm going to give this another go. The Red Wings are close, new general manager, new guy to work with, fresh face in the sky, so to speak. Let's see what happens. But I would imagine that they hire someone quite methodically. The guy that I had in mind actually is already gone now when I was looking at it, and that would be Kevyn Adams. But that's, I know we're going to get to him later, but someone that has experience developing players, someone that can cultivate and put a little Miracle Grow on the Motor City would be my guess.
Yeah, going to be very interesting to see what happens here in Detroit. But do want to move on to some of the other topics we got to talk about here today. One of which is over in Philadelphia. The Flyers have agreed to a 4-year deal with Trevor Zegras that holds a $9.125 million AAV. This is after the offer sheet drama with Anaheim and Leo Carlsson. Obviously, Anaheim matched that offer sheet, and so then Philadelphia moved on and they moved to their other priorities. And Zegras obviously was a priority for them. Zegras, he had career highs in goals and points during his first season with the Flyers last year. Mike, do you think that this is a fair value for Zegras, this AAV? And do you think he'll be able to maintain the level of production that he put up this past season?
And speaking to members of the media that I know in Philadelphia, they were expecting a deal for Zegras to be longer than 4 years and more than 9.125. So it was probably a compromise. He bounced back after 2 off seasons in Anaheim, and he had a really good year, as you said, at 67 points. I think they expect his production to maintain, but the thing is, he's not a center. He never will be a center. He's bad defensively. He's not particularly good on faceoffs, so he probably has to play on the wing, and he'd probably be a great fit on the wing of a number 1 offensive line. The problem is they don't have a number 1 center, and that was the whole thing behind Carlsson. And I don't know whether they're going to be able to get a number 1 center unless they can convince Detroit to trade them Dylan Larkin, or 2 years down the road, Connor McDavid or Austin Matthews hit the market. And the likelihood of that is not great. So Philadelphia's in that weird position of being in the middle, on the middle of the road, having some talent but not enough talent. He's a good, talented player and very skilled, but he needs to be a complementary guy and not a centerpiece guy. And right now, he's a centerpiece guy for the Flyers.
Yeah, I personally was a little surprised to see how short the deal was. 4 years seems to, it gives them a little bit more flexibility, both for the player and for the team. But Frank, what do you think of the overall value of this deal? Do you agree with Mike about Zegras' future and whether or not that might be at center? And how do you see this deal aging?
I really like that word you used, Emma, flexibility. Danny Briere has shown time and time again that, like Bruce Lee, he can take the shape of water and he can go into a number of different avenues. If the Carlsson thing didn't work out like it didn't, okay, we'll go take a look at Trevor Zegras and lock him up. And that term, I think, is fair. And I think the value is fair because, like you said, it gives the player and the team some flexibility. I think Zegras needs some work defensively, but he's grown defensively as well in Philadelphia. So I think, if he grows defensively, I could see him being a centerpiece player if he grows defensively. Now, that's a big if, and I look forward to seeing how he develops his back-checking style. But from what I saw of him down the stretch, his back-checking was infinitely better than Anaheim. So let's see how he does in the city of brotherly love. But I like this deal for both parties, gives them wiggle room and flexibility if things don't work out.
All right. Well, that is one of the extensions that we need to talk about this week. Extensions getting signed all over the league. We got one in Winnipeg as well, Cole Perfetti. They avoided arbitration with Perfetti. The Winnipeg Jets did agree to a 5-year, $30 million extension. So that's $6 million AAV on Wednesday. Perfetti's production admittedly took a step back this season, although if you look around him on the Jets roster, it's kind of hard to find someone whose production didn't take a step back this season. So you take that with a grain of salt. But he finished with 12 goals and 20 assists in 68 games. That comes after he put up a 50-point season the year before. And again, similarly, that year before, the Winnipeg Jets outperformed expectations sort of across the board. So it's really kind of hard to gauge. I think the real Cole Perfetti and the real Winnipeg Jets are probably somewhere in between those two seasons that we saw from them. But Mike, do you think that Perfetti can end up outperforming the value of this contract? Because this does look like a little bit on the lower end for what he was able to do, especially 2 seasons ago.
Yeah, I mean, this is a roll of the dice by Kevin Cheveldayoff. He's looking at Perfetti and hopes that he grows into a number 2 center role behind Mark Scheifele. With the cap going up, $6 million is basically what 4 or 4.5 was a few years ago. So I think they're gambling that he grows into a 55 to 60 point center, and that he becomes consistent, and that he's a solid producer. And if he does do those things, then $6 million a couple years down the road is going to be a bargain. But what Winnipeg has to worry about is the overall picture of the Jets based on whether Connor Hellebuyck stays or goes. And I think that affects everything that they do. You know, Perfetti could score 70 points, but if Hellebuyck isn't there to backstop them, then he'll be scoring 70 points on a non-playoff team. So everything surrounds what is going on with Hellebuyck. But I think it's a decent signing. It's a decent bet by Cheveldayoff. And I think it's a gamble on a talented player. And for their sake, I hope it pans out.
Frank, what do you think of this contract? It seems like it could end up being a really good value for the Jets if Perfetti does perform up to expectations.
Emma, I'd be surprised if Perfetti didn't exceed expectations on this contract. You look at what he was surrounded with, like you mentioned, but let's not forget, he missed the first 14 games of the regular season with a high ankle sprain. So that will limit someone's production as well. So it was a perfect storm for him to take a step back, and through no fault of his own. He had injuries and just unfortunate circumstances around him that Jets underperformed. So I would be surprised if he didn't overperform. And like Augello said, $6 million down the road is going to be a bargain. And this is a low risk, high reward situation. If the Jets end up moving Hellebuyck, maybe you get some assets in return that could complement Cole Perfetti. There is so much in flux with the Winnipeg Jets. It does all hinge around Connor Hellebuyck and what he decides to do. And I'd like to see, how Perfetti bounces back, and for a larger sense, how the Winnipeg Jets bounce back as a team. And Perfetti could and may be a big part of that.
Very true. Like I said, I'm interested to see what happens with the Jets this year after outperforming and then underperforming expectations. You kind of assume you're going to see some sort of regression to the mean here this year, but Perfetti obviously going to be a big part of whatever they do moving forward. Still got some free agent signings happening, even well after July 1st at this point. Some of the deals are trickling in, though this one that I want to talk about is a little surprising, I think, with how long it took. That's Anthony Mantha. He just signed a 2-year contract with the New Jersey Devils worth $9.5 million, so $4.75 million per year. Mantha is coming off a 1-year, $1.25 million deal, kind of a prove-it deal with the Pittsburgh Penguins, where it seemed like he did just that. He proved it. He had 33 goals, 64 points in 84 games. It was assumed that based on his regular season production that he was going to cash in free agency this year, that he was going to be really valuable. Unfortunately, disappeared a bit in the playoffs. You got to wonder how much that really hurt his value in free agency, but finally comes off the board now, heads to New Jersey. Mike, do you think that this is going to be a good fit for the Devils? And are you surprised that it took this long for Mantha to sign a contract?
I'm not surprised it took this long, because I think there are a lot of doubters out there about Anthony Mantha, not in his ability. He's always had ability. It's his availability. It's the fact that, he scored 25 goals. I think it was 6 seasons ago, and it took 6 years for him to get up to a level where he scored his career high. I think probably him and his agent were looking for a multi-year deal, probably 3, 4, 5 years. And that wasn't out there because nobody trusts that he can stay healthy. He stayed healthy last year. He had a great year, but it was a good gamble on the part of Kyle Dubas and the Pittsburgh Penguins to sign him, and they got paid off, and now he's trying to get paid off, and he got a decent deal. But I think had he not had the record of being injured as much as he had been in the past, I think he would have been able to have a bigger payday. As for the Devils, they added Evan Rodriguez. Now they add Mantha. The problem is they don't have a goaltender. They have 3 goalies. When you have 3 goalies, you don't have a goalie. So I would be surprised if they were not in the Hellebuck sweepstakes. But if they're going to go with Nico Dawes and David Rittich and Jake Allen, they're in trouble. They're not a playoff team.
Yeah, you would know with the whole 3 goalies is no goalies situation. Had a similar situation in Buffalo for a while last year. Frank, when you look at Anthony Mantha, his free agency saga, are you surprised that it took this long? And then how do you see him fitting in with the Devils?
I'm not surprised it took this long, because there are 2 eyes that come up with Anthony Mantha: injuries and inconsistency. And, let's wind the clock back a few years. Okay. He was doing fabulous with the Detroit Red Wings, and the Washington Capitals traded Jacob Vrana, and I believe it was a 3rd-round pick, to the Detroit Red Wings for Mantha, and he did nothing. He wasn't what they expected out of him in Washington. And part of that was inconsistency. Part of that, he got hurt. He stayed in Washington for 2 or 3 years, was with Vegas and Calgary, and that prove-it deal, like you said, Emma, he proved it. I'm not surprised about the duration. I'm a little surprised about the dollar figure, but that goes with the cap going up, so you can't really be surprised. I see him fitting in the middle 6. They're going to expect him to produce, because if the goaltending situation stays as is, like Augello referenced, they're going to need to score a lot to win games, because you've got 3 goalies, and none of them are all that good in terms of a starting role. So you're going to need extra offense to compensate for lack of goaltending depth. So I'd imagine they expect a lot out of him, and I'm curious to see how he produces with that kind of pressure.
Well, yeah, the goaltending situation is definitely an issue, I think, in New Jersey when you look as we get into August here, and you want to see what they're going to do there. With that goaltending, Mike, I referenced Buffalo, but I actually want to go back to Buffalo here for a second, because old friend Kevyn Adams officially back with an NHL front office. He will serve as a senior advisor to Don Sweeney in the Boston Bruins front office. So Adams, of course, was the GM in Buffalo for 5.5 seasons. He got fired in December, just before the Sabres' drought-busting run to the playoffs. So the timing there is hard to ignore. But Mike, obviously covering the Sabres and being familiar with Kevyn Adams, do you think he'll fit well in Boston?
Well, I mean, the funny thing is, you look around the NHL and you look at John Davidson being hired in Buffalo. You look at Patrick Allvin being hired in Seattle. Missing one here. Rob Blake in Nashville, and now Kevyn Adams in Boston. And if you're hiring a senior advisor to advise the general manager what not to do, then all 4 of these hires make a lot of sense. Kevyn Adams may have been limited by ownership in Buffalo. He put together a good scouting staff, and they drafted well, and he made some decent trades, but it just didn't work here. Now, you look at I'm sure there's some influence that Kevyn Adams has already had in Boston, because they immediately after hiring him traded for JJ Peterka. So it's like it's the Buffalo Sabres retirement home. Casey Middlestad, Nikita Zadorov, Peterka, Connor Clifton. It's like every ex-Sabre is going to end up in Boston. I mean, I'm sure he can provide something. in terms of a perspective to Don Sweeney, but I hope he doesn't provide too much of a perspective if you're a fan of the Boston Bruins.
Well, you kind of have to imagine with all those other names that you mentioned, Alvin and Blake, that it might be sort of a stepping stone for them back into what you assume is their desired role in the front office. But Frank, what do you think of this hire for Boston? And what do you think of Adams, his career moving forward? Do you think that he stays in Boston? How do you think that he'll be able to take on this role?
Emma, I've said it before and I'll say it again here. Kevyn Adams is the reason the Buffalo Sabres return to the playoffs. He's the true mastermind behind the Buffalo Sabres return to postseason form. Look at what he did with drafts, trades, and Augello hit the nail on the head. He was limited by ownership. The Jacobs family can spend boatloads more money on players than the Buffalo Sabres ever will. And that's a good thing for Kevyn Adams because the handcuffs are off for him. He, in my opinion, shouldn't have gotten fired in Buffalo. I feel like he got a raw deal over there. And the Boston Bruins are going to be better for bringing him in. They're going to have now a bolstered scouting staff. They're going to look at guys in the NCAA. They're going to look at guys out in the Western League. And they're going to have a more cohesive scouting unit because Kevyn Adams is there. I am so looking forward to watching the Boston Bruins this year. See what Kevyn Adams can work out behind the scenes and allow those players on the ice and on the bench to be more cohesive together. Yes, things didn't work out in Buffalo, but because it didn't work out in Buffalo due to things outside of his control doesn't mean Kevyn Adams is a bad general manager. I see him stepping back into a GM's chair within 5 years. That's just my personal opinion on it. Having watched what he did in Buffalo, talking with people close to Kevyn Adams, he's a scouting wizard, and I'm excited to see what he does in Boston.
Well, we will have to see what happens with him in Boston. Of course, meanwhile, back in Buffalo, the Sabres were busy this week. They extended Peyton Krebs on a 4-year, $18 million contract. That's $4.5 million AAV. Krebs is 25 years old. He was eligible for arbitration this summer after setting career highs with 12 goals and 27 assists last year with the Sabres. They obviously avoided arbitration and were able to get this extension done. So, Mike, as our resident Sabres expert, what do you think of this deal for both the player and the team?
I think it's fair. I think it's market value. If you look at some of the contracts that were signed, I know Toronto with Colton Sissons and Jack Roslovic, that was in the 4 to 4.25 range. The Jack Drury deal in Nashville, they're similar type of players. I think, the funny thing is Krebs was a scorer in junior, was expected to be a scorer at the NHL level, and has sort of morphed into a fourth line guy who can be an agitator, who can play center or wing. Lindy Ruff refers to him as a Swiss Army knife, that he can move him up and down the lineup. So he's valuable. And the funny thing is, the Sabres did a good job in terms of locking up the guys like Zach Benson on long-term deals. Beck Malenstein for 6 years, which I thought was a little bit too long, but okay. And now Krebs, they just did a bad job on the big guys. They didn't sign Bowen Byram because he wanted to be a number one defenseman and they had to trade him. And they lost Alex Tuck because they didn't want to pay him over $10 million. So, the Sabres did some good business, but right now, as they currently stand, they're not as good a team as they were when they were in the playoffs.
Well, you do have to wonder how big of a step back Buffalo is going to end up taking this year with the subtractions. Yes, they made the extensions for Zach Benson and now for Krebs as well. But like you said, Mike, missing some of those bigger pieces that were big parts of their team last year. So, Frank, when you look at this extension for Krebs, are you impressed by this deal? Do you think that this is a deal that's going to be positive for both sides? Do you think it's going to be enough to sort of offset maybe some of those subtractions that the Sabres made this offseason? How do you see this deal aging moving forward?
Well, I don't think it's going to be enough to offset the subtractions, especially on the back end. Another name that left the organization, Michael Kesselring. And Kesselring was a pretty important piece for them in a pinch. And he goes to San Jose. So you've lost two significant defensemen plus Alex Tuck I mean, so that's a huge those are some significant losses for the Buffalo Sabres. In terms of Peyton Krebs, I feel like you almost have to extend him in a certain respect because he was the cornerstone of the Jack Eichel deal. I mean, I feel like you kind of have to extend him on some level just to continue to reap some benefits from the Jack Eichel trade. But like Augello said, he was a monster in juniors. Believe he was with the former Winnipeg Ice in the Western League before they became the Wenatchee Wild. So I think he's an invaluable piece to them. You can plug him in anywhere. He's like a universal television remote, and you can flip the channel wherever you want and plug Peyton Krebs in the lineup. I think it's a great move for both parties. You know, he's worked on that agitation part of his game, but he can still channel some of that junior scoring and utilize it when Buffalo needs him. If some of their top producers aren't coming through, hey, let's shake things up. Throw Peyton Krebs in the top six, see where things go, give a little jolt of energy to the guys, and maybe that can bring some scoring. And we've seen that at times throughout the season. So I like this move for Buffalo.
Well, Peyton Krebs with that 4-year contract extension. We got one last contract extension to talk about today, and that is Nick Robertson with the Pittsburgh Penguins. So he avoided arbitration, of course, after getting traded to the Penguins by Toronto, agreed to a 2-year deal with Pittsburgh, making $3.25 million AAV. So Robertson, like I said, he was part of that trade from Toronto to Pittsburgh, traded for a 4th-round pick back on July 1st. He's 24 years old. He has 16 goals and 16 assists in 78 games last season. And now, Mike, Robertson's a guy that we've talked about before as someone who's been perhaps underutilized in Toronto and could maybe be capable of taking on a larger role, and maybe his numbers, at least from last season, are reflective of that. But do you think that he will become a bigger part of the Penguins offense more so than he was in Toronto, especially given the Kyle Dubas connection there?
Knowing the fortunes of the Toronto Maple Leafs, whenever they trade someone to the Pittsburgh Penguins, I would say it's an absolute guarantee. If you look, and I'm old enough to remember when they traded a Norris Trophy winning defenseman and Randy Carlyle for an over-the-hill Dave Burrows in the late 70s. They traded Phil Kessel, and Phil Kessel helped them win 2 Stanley Cups. So I've always been a fan of Nick Robertson's skill set. I've never thought he'd been utilized correctly by Sheldon Keefe or by Craig Berube. Berube gave him more of an opportunity, but they always treated him as a 3rd, 4th liner, and he has a top 6 skill set. The thing is, defensively, he's not good enough to play in the top 6. But sometimes if you have a guy who has a shot like Nick Robertson, you eat the defensive problems and you just watch him score 30 goals. And if he plays with Malkin, or I don't think he'll play with Crosby, but if he plays with Malkin on a second line with, say, Brian Rust or Raquel, he's going to score 30 goals. And knowing the Maple Leafs, they'll have given up a 30-goal score for a 4th-round pick.
Yeah, I liked this trade a lot for Pittsburgh. I like this deal as well. I think $3.25 million per year, a very good bit of business for them. I think that, Frank, I'll ask your opinion, but I feel like this is a contract where Robertson could end up outperforming this contract if everything breaks right here.
You're spot on with that, Emma. And I was laughing because I remember the Phil Kessel deal when it broke. I think I was just entering high school when that happened. So shows you how young I am. But I think it goes to the point that you kind of compensate for a player's shortcomings with the people you put around him. You know, this goes back to that Cole Perfetti thing we talked about earlier. Yes, you know, his performance went down, but what did he have around him? And I think the inverse is true with Robertson. You know, he's got a little bit of defensive issues. Okay, let's put him with a Brian Rust and an Evgeny Malkin, balance it out, and you've got one heck of a second line there. I think this could be a really strong move for the Pittsburgh Penguins.
I have to agree with you there. I think that this is going to end up being a really strong signing for the Penguins, a good extension here as well. Of course, if you want to read any more about any of the contracts, the extensions, the rumors, anything that we've talked about here today on the show, you can always head over to the Hockey News. It's been the go-to for all things hockey since 1947. 12 issues packed with game and player insights, plus a free issue to start. It's a must-have for any fan. Head over to thn.com/free and grab your subscription today. That's going to do it for today's episode of the Wraparound. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in and listened to us talking some hockey today. We really do appreciate it. We will be back with an all-new episode next week. But for now, for Michael Augello and Frank Zawrazky, I'm Emma Lingan. This is the Wraparound, and we will see you next time.